So we are still going through the 10 words, which for anyone who hasn't been here or still hasn't understood, these are the 10 commandments. But the way that they are described throughout the Old Testament is actually saying the 10 words. And ultimately, they're more than just being about commandments. They're about understanding what it means to, as the end of the video said, to love both God and man, to understand what it means to really live in being a follower of God, what that actually looks like. They're the expectations of what's going to happen as the people of Israel enter into the covenant with God. And these are many of the things that are going to be controlling the way that they're looking at life. We've seen the first two so far, the first one of having no other gods before him. And it has to do with the fact that because God, from the very beginning, is the provider of all things, when we try to have other gods, whether it's ourselves or other things that we're putting our trust in or trying to put our identity in, then it begins to mix, and it's harder to see and clearly understand that God is the provider because we start to look to those other places as providing for us. And then closely connected to it is the second one about idols and how when we look at what that means, it goes back to the very beginning of God creating everything in his image, and that idols were always in the image of the God that it was representing. And so God created humanity as his image, but they never really lived up to what it was supposed to be. So Jesus came as the perfect and the true image of God and what that looks like. So we have no need for idols to even understand who God is because we've seen Jesus and we have an understanding of who he is and what he's all about. And so that leads us here to the third word, which is I am more than a name. And this one is typically, it's what we consider the third commandment, and it's you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. For the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. And when we really begin to think and know about how people use this, it more has the idea of do not say his name in vain. And it's not really exactly what it's referring to. It's similar to what I spoke about 2 weeks with the first commandments about before having different meanings and understandings even in English, and the word take can have that same understanding. For starters, you can take something a certain way, which is to understand something in that way. You can actually physically take something, or again, it can even, in some sense, be how most people understand this of taking or saying or using in some sense. And so those are different ways we can understand it. And so really, we have to go back and look at what this is really trying to communicate. And the most specific way to translate that word is you will not lift up the name of Yahweh your God for a vain thing, because Yahweh will not leave unpunished whoever lifts up his name for a vain thing. And so it's the idea, but even the idea of lifting up has multiple meanings to it. Again, it can be what ultimately many of the Jews began to take by the time of Jesus of blasphemy, of either lifting up one's own name to be equal to God or bringing God's name down. Or it can really mean the best way to really translate this is that you will not bear or carry the name of the Lord in vain. And that starts to help us understand a little better what the word's trying to communicate of basically carrying something around. When it's saying take or use, it's taking the name, or really the authority which is found in the name, and using it in a way that is not in accordance with God. And so I have a few examples of trying to help us better understand what that means. This first one here is what was a Roman standard. They would carry these into battle, and it didn't just represent that they were a part of Rome, but it also would signify which part of the army they were a part of. But the point is that when they carried that into it, again, it represented that they were coming from Rome. They were a part of that army, and they thus represented the government of Rome, whether it was the Senate during the Roman Republic or the emperor during the Roman Empire. They were representing both the government as a whole and the people who were in charge of it. kind of like in ancient times where when a messenger would carry the word of someone of greater authority, he was coming to the people to tell them in the name of the king or whoever was sending him to tell them stuff. And so he was supposed to act and work in concordance with what he was being sent with. So if a Roman soldier is acting out of line with what's expected of them toward the people, again, like the commandment said, they would face punishment from the leaders who were in charge of them because they weren't acting in line with it. And so again, when we understand name, can connect it with the idea of authority, it comes with this reality, is that when you're bearing or carrying the name of the Lord, you too are coming under what God has called you to, what he has sent you with, and when you aren't living up to it, that becomes a problem. Another similar way or example that we can take that we kind of get in our own culture but is a little different is just the idea of a name in general. To them, a name meant everything, and people within a household were under basically the oldest male who existed within that. And so like the people were usually called so-and-so, son of whoever their father or even their grandfather was, depending on who's living. So like when Peter is referred to Simon Bar-Jonah, he's being referred to as the son of Jonah, who would have been probably the head of that household that he had been in. And so when he goes out into the world, he represents that household, and everyone in the household represents it. And again, for us today, we just use last names to represent that same thing, but in most parts of the culture, it still doesn't really carry the same air that it used to carry. And some of maybe the more upper class, sometimes the reputation of a family matters, but in some places you'll find that most last names have more of a negative reputation than a positive one. There's not much to, in a sense, live up to as it was for them, because living up to that name was of great importance. And so when you're bearing that name of the family, you're going you're representing them basically. And so when you again act out of accordance with it, you're tarnishing that name. And it's the same thing that happens when we do that before God. And so to try to help maybe even give a little bit better understanding, there's a few stories throughout the Bible, the first one in the Old Testament, the next two in the New Testament, that can kind of help us both wrap our minds around this understanding, but also the fact that help us move towards what it means to us today. And so with this first one in 1 Samuel 4, verses 4 through 6, it's at the very end of the period of the judges, right before Samuel helps establish the kingdom and the kings leading the people. And the people of Israel were at war with the Philistines, and so they've gone out to war, and things didn't go so well for them the first day. And so they get this idea that they're going to go and take the Ark of the Covenant into battle with them. And so they go, and especially since Eli's sons, who were wicked and doing all things their own way anyways, were the ones in charge of it, they had likely no problem with it. And again, it doesn't come without precedence, because there were times when God had told them to take the Ark of the Covenant to battle with them. So it's not like it was just came out of nowhere, but their motivation for doing it is the problem. God had not told them to do it this time, and they were doing it because they were attempting to manipulate God to give them victory, because it wasn't working on their own, so they thought that bringing the ark with them was going to accomplish something. And we see what they were trying to accomplish when the Philistines react to the fact that the Ark of the Covenant had come into the camp of the Israelites, and they started freaking out because they knew the stories of what God had done to the Egyptians and leading the people out of Egypt and into Israel. And so they're worried about what's going to happen to them because God had come with them. But they ultimately tried to encourage one another to go out to war, and ultimately the Philistines do end up winning. And so we see the fact that the Israelites were trying to use the name of the Lord in vain and manipulate God by taking the ark into battle with them. and it didn't end up going so well for them. But because God has control of things, he's not going to allow his name to be tarnished to the nation. So the rest of the story happens is the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant and put it into the temple of their God, and they come in the next morning, and their God, the statue of him, is bowed down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And so they put it back up, and then the same thing happens again the next day, except for the idol is basically shattered and destroyed when it falls to the ground. But the point is that because God is the God of gods, all gods will bow down to him. And so it's just the natural order of things, but it is to teach the Philistines that they didn't win that battle because their God was greater, which is typically the way that those people saw how those battles went, but it was because God had allowed them to win. He teaches, Nebuchadnezzar the same kind of thing over the years, and God will show that to people that what's happening isn't because of what they've done, but because of what God has allowed. Even that scripture that I read earlier is making that point that when they see Jerusalem destroyed, it's because of their disobedience, not because the gods around them are any stronger than God. And so God still lifts up his own name in this situation, even though they had tried to manipulate it and it didn't go well for them because of that. So then the next story comes out of the book of Acts in chapter 19. And here, a bunch of miracles are happening to the point where even Paul's handkerchief can be given to someone and they'll be healed. And so people are seeing that, and the 7 sons of Sceva see that, and they decide that they're going to go and try to cast out this demon. And so when they go, they say, I adjure you in the name of Jesus who Paul preaches. And so the demon basically laughs at them and says, I know Jesus and I even recognize Paul, but who are you? And it's because the fact that they didn't come in the authority of Jesus. They didn't know him, so they weren't coming in his authority. They just heard the great things that Paul had been doing when he was preaching, the great miracles that accompanied it, and so they thought they were going to take advantage of it and try to get some of that for themselves, ultimately to bring own glory to themselves rather than God anyways. But because they weren't coming under authority of the name, they had no ability to actually cast out the demon. So the demon attacked them and sent them out naked and wounded, and so it clearly showed them, again, trying to manipulate God to accomplish something for themselves, and it doesn't end up going well. But yet, again, in that situation, God's name is still glorified, and many start to come and recognize him, and in Ephesus, they start throwing out all their magical stuff and turning to God because of it. And then in the final story here in Acts, we get a bunch of people early on in the church selling their property and giving it to the church. And so Ananias and Sapphira come along and they decide they're going to do the same thing, except for they're not going to actually give all of the money to the church. They decide they're going to act like they're doing that and say that they sold it for this much and give that to the church, but they sold it for more and kept some for themselves. And again, they're trying to both manipulate God and the people to think that they're doing something good and to, again, bring some kind of glory to themselves that they're doing the right thing, but yet they didn't actually even really do what they were pretending to do. And so, yet again, we see this idea of people who either are under the authority of God using his name in vain or pretending to be under his authority to use his name, and it all comes down to the fact that they're both trying to manipulate God and sometimes even using God and authority coming from him to manipulate people as well. And so we really see throughout these stories how the idea of using the Lord's name in vain really comes down to this idea of manipulating God and manipulating people using that authority. And so one last scripture that I have, it's longer, and I'm going to actually read it to you, but it comes out of Matthew 23. And here Jesus is speaking to the scribes and Pharisees and what is sometimes known as the 8 woes that he gives to them. And in this, we begin to see how they are once again trying to use the authority of God because they were, the leaders of the Jewish people at that time to be able to manipulate people to their own advantage. he starts off saying, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you lock the kingdom of the heavens before men. For you yourselves do not enter, nor do you leave behind the ones entering to enter." And so he starts off right away with the fact that they ultimately were controlling who could enter into the kingdom of God or not, or at least they were thinking that they had that responsibility, and they were not allowing others to enter in. They weren't even really entering themselves because they weren't actually interested in what Jesus was teaching, but they were also trying to not allow others to enter as well. And so again, they're using the authority that they have from God that people recognize in them to manipulate people to their own desires. Then he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you go around the sea and the dry land to make one convert. And whenever he might come to you, you make him a son of Gehenna hell, double of you." And so it's a similar idea to the last one, that they go around to make converts, but really it's to their own religion, not to actually following God, but to their own religion. And when they make them even more zealous for that religion than they themselves even were in the first place. And so, again, it's about using that authority from God. They had to manipulate people to follow them rather than actually be following God. "Woe to you, blind leaders, the ones saying, 'Whoever might swear on the temple, it is nothing, but whoever might swear on the gold of the temple, he is obligated.' Fools and blind men, for what is greater, the gold or the temple, the one having sanctified the gold? And saying, 'Whoever might swear on the altar, it is nothing, but whoever might swear on the gift, the one over it, he is obligated. Blind men, for what is greater, the gift or the altar, the one sanctifying the gift? Therefore, the one having sworn on the altar swears on it and on all the things over it. And the one having sworn on the temple swears on it and on the one dwelling in it. And the one having sworn on heaven swears on the throne of God and the one sitting over it." And so, once again, we really see how basically here they're just playing games with people. They're saying, likely they're trying to force people to, swear on the gift that is on the altar, while they would swear on the altar itself, and then they would say, "Well, we're not actually obligated to do that thing, but you guys are obligated because of what you swore on." And so they're playing games so they can get out of doing what they don't want to do, but forcing people to do the same thing. So again, it's a manipulation game that they are playing to try to control the people, all because, again, they have what they believe and what the people see is the authority that comes from God. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you tithe the mint and the dill and the cumin and leave behind the burdensome heavy things of the law, the judgment and the mercy and the trust. These things it was necessary to do, and those things to not leave behind. Blind leaders, the ones filtering out the gnat but devouring the camel." And so here, again, they're making sure they don't fail in the smallest things of the law, but they're ignoring the rest of it, the actual point of it in the first place. They're not concerned with loving God or loving others or anything else God was trying to teach them through these things. They got so caught up in the letter of the law that they missed the spirit of the law, and they're teaching the people to do that very same thing. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are fully filled out of robbery and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, cleanse first the inside of the cup, in order that also the outside of it might come to be pure, clean." And again, they make themselves look great on the outside, but on the inside, it says they're full of robbery and self-indulgence. And so the various things that they should be preaching against, they're actually doing themselves. While looking good on the outside and different things that they do, they're actually not clean at all on the inside. And again, it's just another one of their manipulation games. They look good so the people will trust them and think they have the authority from God, but they're just simply manipulating people with what they're doing. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you are very much like graves having been plastered white, which on the one hand outside appear beautiful, but on the other hand inside are fully filled of dead bones and every impurity. Thus also ye yourselves on the one hand outside appear righteous to men, but on the other hand inside are full of pretending and lawlessness. And so this is basically the same thing as the last one, but Jesus takes it further and shows them that they look righteous on the outside, but inside it's just a show. It's a game that they're pretending they're just as dead as the bones of a grave, and they're actually living in lawlessness rather than living by the law like they are claiming to do. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build up the graves of the prophets and adorn the tombs of the righteous. And you say, if we were in the days of our fathers, we would not have been sharers of them in the blood of the prophets, so that you are testifying to yourselves that you are sons of the ones having murdered the prophets. And you fulfill the measure of your fathers. Snakes, offspring of vipers, how might you escape from the judgment of Gehenna hell? And so Jesus finishes the part of this off here with the reality that they're building up the graves of the prophets. They're acting like they love all of the words that the prophets said, but yet they are doing the very same things that their fathers did in reference to the process. They might preach the prophets, they might pretend that they actually agree with them, but yet, and Jesus shows us elsewhere, the fact that they're trying to kill him proves that they're in the exact same place as the people who were killing the prophets, because Jesus had come in the same name of the Father that the prophets had, but they're rejecting him just as much as their fathers rejected the prophets. And so it proves how far they have come in trying to ultimately manipulate people. And so this is really what it all boils down to when we're talking about God being more than a name. It does carry the idea that it's not really what we tend to think about saying the Lord's name in vain. It's not as if there's not some point in this that leads to that being a problem, but it's not the real understanding that they would have had or what we're really supposed to get out of this. It does have to do with what some will say about, claiming to be followers of the Lord, but then doing whatever we want. That certainly is a way of manipulating people and of manipulating God to bear the Lord's name in vain. But it also goes down to the things like what Jesus is ultimately going against the Pharisees for, their lack of love in all of this. That their manipulation is that they were teaching the law, claiming to be followers of it, but having no love for the people in the process. There was no they missed the whole point of what all of it was truly trying to communicate, and because of that, they actually ended up breaking more of the law than they even realized in the first place. You'll actually see in a couple of weeks that there's another place where Jesus gets at them for breaking another one of the 10 commandments because they were upholding their own traditions. They were doing these other things that were going in opposite directions. And so there's so much that this describes, but again, it goes back to bearing the name of God means that you're coming under the authority of God and being a representative of him to the people of the earth. And so when you're living out of line with that, and again, it includes all of it, not just the parts that we want to do or not including the parts we don't want, but it includes all of what it means to actually be a follower of God. And so we have to live in alignment with all of that if we're actually going to not take his name in vain, that we have to take ourselves and our entire lives need to be formed around what Jesus had done and what he has called us to do, that we're supposed to follow in that true image that Jesus is of God and live like that. And that's how we avoid taking his name in vain. Instead of just doing the things that we tend to think, we need to follow him, follow what he has called us to do, and that's how we truly avoid bearing the name of the Lord in vain. And that is why God is more than a name, and that is why we must uphold this reality that he is the one, he is the standard, and we are to live up to that standard. And as we go about being representatives of him, he is the standard we are to follow. And that's really what it means. It means this is about living up to that standard and not falling into all of these different traps of ultimately trying to manipulate God to get what we want out of something, where we're doing things, even good things, just so that he'll give us what we want, or using the authority that comes from God to manipulate people, to not love them in the right way, but instead to make them do what we are wanting them to do rather than what God has actually called them to do.